Okay, so this is, once again, Notes Towards the Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, Part 12, titled after David's title for his Part 11, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And if you've been following our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristophanes' reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of Oedipus in his comedy The Smile of the Sphinx, you will recall that we left off at that point following Act 1, Scene 1, in which Tiresias is visited by three dreams. And we'll say more about that before we proceed on. But then David moved on to his reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Act 1, Scene 2, in which Tiresias embarks upon a journey to the Theban palace in order to convince and persuade through a number of varieties of deception to convince and persuade Laius to send an entourage. Well, we can't even really say that, David says. We can't even really say that, that Tiresias persuades Laius to send an entourage to the crossroads, to the Tripleus Amoxitois, the fork in the road. That place in which Daulis branches toward Delphi, because his persuasion is an act of deception designed to manipulate the king, into a series of actions that will end in his own self-destruction, and so that deception is motivated, by the depth of Tiresias' understanding of the violation of the sacred, and the inevitability, in a certain sense, of the violation of the taboo, that either son will destroy father, or father will destroy son, and the only way, to get out of the bind, right, that's created, by this playing out of the prophecy, and the kind of apple of discord, David refers to the apple of discord, the apple, to the fairest, thrown at the banquet of Thetis and Peleus, and at their wedding feast, and what this apple of discourse caused, and the prophecy, the initial prophecy, made by the oracle at Delphi, that this child, would murder his father, is in many ways, David claims, like this apple of discord. It unravels into all of these, inevitable or ineluctable, conflicts that only seem to be able to be resolved through the playing out, right, of the playing out of in the case of the story of Helen, and the playing out of the rather elaborate unfolding, right, of all of the conflict-driven elements of plot, right, that are inspired by competition for this particular prize, that is the prize of being named as the fairest, right, and to be granted this epithet, the fairest, that the apple of discord promises. And David talks a bit about fate here, and the inevitability of all of that, as he pauses, before moving on to what Tiresias has to tell Laius, and the way that what he tells Laius is a deception, and what the deception is motivated by, and his understanding of Laius, and the psychology that belongs to this particular kind of narcissistic tyrant, and someone who was capable of attempting the murder of their infant child already, and there are a number of other we won't get into all of it. It's rather unsavory. David discusses it. I won't discuss it here, but Laius has a background of unsavory and disarmingly terrifying, a disarmingly and terrifying history of violence and horrifying behavior, which, although it's not revealed in Aristophanes' depiction of how Tiresias gains this knowledge, is somehow made available to Tiresias, David claims. And then David goes on and describes what it is that Tiresias reveals to Laius, and what it is that he leaves out, and why. And again, we can correct David's use of pronouns here and say they, what they leave out. And before I go on, I'm gonna there's the new puppy, the neighbor's new puppy is the neglected puppy is crying, and then so Fiverr is crying in response to the neglected puppy. It's cold outside. I don't know what the temperature is. I was out in my bare feet on the concrete, and I could tell that it was cold because my feet don't get cold easily, but they were cold on the concrete. So it must be in the teens or below in Fahrenheit, and certainly below freezing. That may be one of the reasons why the puppy is crying. But Fiverr wants to go out and see if he's okay. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll return. And I think I can remember where I am in narrating David Antin's account. Well, he seems to be okay now. Maybe I can just go on. If Fiverr starts crying again, I'll I'll go ahead and let him out. But the puppy has, you probably can't hear the puppy. I can hear the puppy, and I can certainly hear Fiverr, but you might not. There's the puppy barking again, so Fiverr will probably start acting up. But we'll see how it goes. In any case, David, sort of informs the audience in advance, where he's going with he's going with his reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story, and how he's going to describe what it is that Tiresias, and he again keeps shifting back and forth between she, and I think at this point he says she, and we can say they, reveal to Laius, and what they don't, and the reasons and the motivations for that. But what becomes interesting, stepping out of the recounting of David's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of this particular narrative, is the way that in filling in all of the details of the way that Tiresias engages the telling, and the deceptions that lie behind it, David necessarily reifies the narrative here through his understanding of elements that belong to the future of this narrative, in the engagement of Tiresias in Act 1, Scene 2. His understanding of the motivations that are revealed there come in to the way that he narrates and tells the story here. In other words, he knows that Tiresias is deceiving Laius in a certain sense, but he knows this only because there's a contradiction between what Tiresias reveals to Laius in Act 1, Scene 2, and what Tiresias reveals to the Sphinx in Act 1, Scene 3. And his knowledge of Act 1, Scene 3 comes into, the way that he tells the story of Act 1, Scene 2. And because in a certain sense, he knows, because he's seen the entirety of the play, he knows the motivations that Tiresias has for lying and deceiving Laius. And he utilizes that knowledge, to flesh out this scene in which, if we had never seen the play before, we wouldn't know yet that Tiresias is engaged in these acts of rhetorical deception, and perhaps we wouldn't know why and what his motivations are, but the point of investing in this explanation of the reification, of the narrative, the psychological reification of the narrative, and the recollaging, of the elements through which it's revealed. The point of our pointing that out is to underscore, this idea that we're attempting to present, that narrative is always already a reification of the elements that occur linearly, if they even did, because space is discontinuous, because time is discontinuous, and because memory is discontinuous and bound by by all of by all of the influences of not only the pseudologoi, but whatever else it was that Pandora let out of the Pythos, correct? And so we can never imagine that there's this aletheia that belongs to a kind of one-to-one correspondence, between the actual events of either a reality, or a telling, and the way that it's retold. And in this case, the reality is the way that this fiction, might be told in material, in the material world, in the real unfolding of the drama in space and time, via all of these elements upon the stage. And so David inevitably brings his understanding and his memory of what happens in Act 1, Scene 3 to his recounting of Act 1, Scene 2, and not only that, and at this point, I'll break out a little bit further, and say something about the role of interpretation. The Greek word for interpretation, of course, is familiar now to everyone listening. Diomenia, right, is the interpreter, who is the wife of Tiresias. So clearly, when David references Sophocles' version of the story of Oedipus, it's clear that his reading, elaboration, and interpretation is informed by his reading and interpretation of Aristotle's reading and interpretation of Sophocles, right? And Aristotle is reasonably good, provides a reasonably or decent account of Sophocles' Oedipus, but his account of Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx, that is, Aristotle's account of the Smile of the Sphinx, in the second part or volume of the Poetics, the comedy, it's not as good, and and I don't know whether David has read Aristotle's account of the Smile of the Sphinx or not, but in certain places, Aristotle does fairly well. Like he's fairly good at handling what Aristophanes does with the characters Dramatikos, eironicus, and Dramatikos, anagnoreikos. And we've given spoiler alerts on those two figures. Those two figures are the twin messengers that play out this comedy of errors. And perhaps because, right, in certain terms, in the way that Aristotle develops this kind of syllogistic understanding of the revelations, and the way that through a kind of logical thinking, the detective story in Sophocles gets played out. The collapse of the detective story in the confusion of these characters, like the confusion of all these characters named with the same name, Mary, right? Dramatikos and Dramatikos. I mean, it can only be worse if there were a third Dramatikos, which there isn't, fortunately. And this is all an aside that doesn't belong to David's discourse, just to remind everyone of that. But so perhaps, because of that, because he works so much out in relationship to the detective story and the revealing, and because precisely that's what collapses in the comedy of errors that's played out in Act 4, Scene 2 of the Aristophanes, when Aristophanes introduces the messengers, and we'll certainly get to there, but it may not be for a while. That works. But what Aristophanes doesn't seem to perceive, and what David doesn't seem to perceive, and I don't know whether it's because he's following Aristotle's reading of the smile of the Sphinx, or whether it's just that he failed to perceive it, on his own without reading, Aristotle's analysis and formal, right, and formal, schematic, right, graph, one could almost say, of outline of the smile of the Sphinx, in terms of, like he does, like Aristotle does with Sophocles. It's an implementation, essentially, of his idea of the four causes, and the four causes, in some way, is the real motivation, for looking at any of this, to justify, his particular design of ontology, that he relates to a notion of a kind of science of investigation, right? And it almost doesn't matter what it is that Aristotle selects, whether it's a selection of rhetoric, or whether it's a selection of drama as it is in the Poetics, or whether it's a selection of logic. In a certain way, the design is always to justify some aspect of his own organization of knowledge and understanding, whether that is in terms of syllogismos, or in terms of an ontological construction, as it is in the Poetics, or whether it brings both of those concerns together, right, as it does in certain elements of the Poetics, in particular in relationship to anagnoreikos and peripeteia. But the way that syllogismos is the motivation, I would say, for selecting the story of Oedipus as told by Sophocles to begin with. And then he, because he does that, Aristotle, you could say, Aristotle, because he chooses Sophocles, he's forced, to take on Aristophanes, the smile of the Sphinx, and he's completely unprepared, to do so, right? And I don't want to say that, David is unprepared to do so, but for whatever reason, it's clear to me that in the way that David reifies the narrative, he doesn't entirely, comprehend the formal design of the way that Aristophanes puts this comedy together, and the way that it's motivated. So before proceeding on to David's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of that moment in which Tiresias, encounters Laius and informs him of this danger, and provides him with advice, but does so deceptively, and the way that the narrative deception, or the rhetorical deception performed by Tiresias, right, comes into the retelling here, although it's not revealed in the action of the comedy until scene 3, and the way that memory as symphonia, as arrangement, right, informs David's telling, and the way that telling is different from the way that the events actually unfold on stage, and the point, right, of all of those disparities being the reification that inevitably accompanies storytelling and narration and narrative. Before proceeding on to that, I'll briefly attempt to sketch, out my understanding the formal design of the smile of the Sphinx, and then discuss how the design how it differs from the design of Sophocles, Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King, and so first of all, every act, right, is represented by a kind of journey, taken by one of the characters who plays an important role in the unfolding of the story. And so, Act 1 belongs to Tiresias, and then Act 2 belongs to Laius. Act 3 belongs to the Sphinx, and Act 4 belongs to Oedipus. And in Sophocles' version, unlike Aristophanes, we basically begin with what is in Aristophanes' Act 4. We basically begin with the way that the story unfolds from the perspective of Oedipus, right? And that's clear, both in a kind of naive reading of that we might perform of Sophocles, and if we were to read it through Aristotle, right? And but in a certain way, Aristophanes' version is more dialogical, right, in the Bakhtinian sense, because you have these four characters, through which the story more or less is revealed. And although it's revealed in the manner of dialogue on stage, and so not internal, right, internal consciousness and thought, the way that a novel or even lyric poetry might be, but nevertheless, since we follow basically these four characters through their corresponding acts, it has a kind of more dialogical form and feeling than Sophocles does. So that's the first thing. And so already if you want to think about the way that works, is like that we're not the one. We don't identify with the one with in the Wachowski brothers, The Matrix, right? It's an interesting story, and it could be more interesting if perhaps if Neo and his anagrammatical name, right, that references the one, weren't this sort of white male savior figure that's so familiar to these narratives of rescue and metaphysical transformation, right? In all kinds of anyway, you get the idea. So in a certain sense, whether tragic or heroic, right? Oedipus is like this character, like the one, and the identification, is made in terms of this kind of singularity, right, of consciousness, and right away in the Aristophanes, and in the figure of Tiresias, who is never one to begin with, who is always multiple, who is multiple in relationship to gender, who is multiple in relationship to these planes of ontological existence and restriction, right? He traverses, she traverses, they traverse, and through their traversal, we traverse these domains of consciousness that that are depicted symbolically as underworlds and visionary worlds, and then, rhetorically on stage as well. He traverses, she traverses, they traverse, and we, along with them, identify, across these, thresholds and boundaries. And it's comical, yes, but it doesn't, the absurdity and the comedy doesn't really change the terms of the discourse, right? They just change the terms under which the pleasure of the discourse, one could say, is maintained. And then, the fact that both Laius and Oedipus, who will become king, are targets of ridicule, right? And the king, right, and the representation of king as, the singularity is another staple of Western and beyond Western culture as well, right? In the patriarchy, in a certain way, is always, an argument for singularity and one could argue normativity in a certain way, and I don't know if I want to say the divine feminine is always, already an argument for heterogeneity, but I'm tempted to, and I'm tempted to point to the triple goddess and the way that the triple goddess is articulated in Aristophanes, and then moving on from there, the role of the Sphinx, who is also, heterogeneous in terms of her physical existence and her, manner of residing at certain boundaries and liminalities, right? So all of these figures, not only, formally, contribute, to the dialogical, engagement that Aristophanes is making, but symbolically, contribute to that understanding too. And then they provide a kind of discursive argument that belongs, to the heterogeneity of the divine feminine, and as it gets played out across, these various figures, like Tiresias and the Sphinx, and in different modalities, right, of how that might appear, right, under different constraints. And let's turn though back before I lose track of what I wanted to add, to the discourse and to my understanding of what David misses in articulating the form that this particular comedy takes in Aristophanes. So there are 4 acts. Tiresias, basically Act 1 belongs to Tiresias. Act 2 belongs to Laius. Act 3 belongs to the Sphinx. The little puppy's crying again, so we may have to let Fiverr out. Act 4 belongs to the Sphinx. Yeah, Fiverr's responding to the puppy. Act 4 belongs to Oedipus. And then each one of these acts, has its own structure. And the way that I would articulate that structure is the following. Each of the 4 acts have 3 scenes, and in the first scene, one could describe as the Othisi, right? The push, the boost, the impetus, the impulse, the thrust. And so for Tiresias in Act 1, there's a boost, an impetus, an impulse, a thrust, and an Othisi. Then for Laius, there's an Othisi. Then for the Sphinx, there's an Othisi. Then for Oedipus, there's an Othisi. Okay, that's the first the first way that I would articulate like the movements of each one of the acts. There's an othisi. Sorry, my pronunciation isn't as good as David's would be. There's an othisi, and then there's an analipsy, a withdrawal, an undertaking, an assumption, or resumption, and that belongs to the act of. This is where we are. We're in the second scene in the first act, and Tiresias is embarking on their withdrawal or undertaking in this course, an assumption, right? The assumption is that I need to act, I need to separate those two snakes from one another, or else they're going to cause a plague, and this plague will ravage the city of Thebes in the future, and many will die. And it's my job, both as messenger and prophet, and as the keeper of a certain kind of sacred medicine, right? To interfere in the design, right, of this destruction and of Thebes and the inevitable, results of the violation of this taboo. She and she and they and us, right? And we, through our identification with he, him, and her, and them, proceed, right? Through the narrative initially within this subject position, right? Of knowing a certain outcome, being inspired to change the outcome, and then acting and performing in a certain way, and then in the final scene. So to reiterate, an othisi, an analipsy, and then an anavasi. And so a push, a boost, an impetus, which is often formulated under the terms of dream, although dream is represented in different ways, for different characters. So one could say that the othisi for the characters Laius and Oedipus, who are both king, is performed under the guidance or rhetorical deceptions, right, of the rhetorical deceptions, capable at least, under the guidance of the fashioner Morpheus, who presents such dreams to kings. And Morpheus is in a certain way, perhaps for the Greeks, more like the witches at the crossroads, for Macbeth, who provide a prophecy of the future that really, in a certain way, the rhetorical deception it is so complete that and the mask of the terms that actually unfold in the reality of the future, right, are the reality is so hidden within the rhetorical constructions, right? Like that Macbeth shall reign until whatever it is, whatever forest it is, marches to whatever, and then you have these characters, dressed up as trees marching, and anyway, the deception is so thorough there that you can really only understand it as the work of a kind of apple of discord, right? And Morpheus, perhaps functions more in this way, as the kind of dream spirit that has the same sort of intentionality, that Eris has when she presents this reward at the marriage celebration of Peleus and Thetis, the parents of Achilles, and sets this prize of the title the fairest, before those jealous and competitive goddesses who all wish to be the recipients of that prize. And so the Othisi, that motivates. One could say the Othisi that motivates each of the characters in a certain respects belongs to the idea of dream. But dream is figured or configured for Laius and Oedipus, more as a kind of deceptive, Morpheus. And dream is configured for the two more interesting characters in the comedy, that is Tiresias and the Sphinx, as really a figuration of Phoebe, the bringer of light and the dream as a kind of aletheia, a kind of truth of vision, right? The visionary, truth that in a certain respects belongs, not to the pseudologoi or Eris, but to a kind of revelation, right? Apocalyptos of truth, even though the articulation of that truth is necessarily buried in the mysteries, right, and veils that belong, right, to the unfolding of truth as a kind of process, right, kind of almost alchemical process, and that process informs, right, it informs the way that Aristophanes has segmented all of these acts, so that you have this Othisi, this analepsy, and this anavasi, right? So you have this push, boost, impetus, impulse, thrust, toward action that's made, either under the aegis of Phoebe or Morpheus, depending on what your character you're talking about, and those segments represent dreams. And then you have the analepsy, which is either, depending on the character or withdrawal or an undertaking, or the resumption, or the resumption of an action toward, and since we placed one under the guidance of a goddess, we might as well place this one as well. The analepsy, all of these actions, either metaphorically or literally, take place at a crossroads, and either metaphorically or literally, take place at a tripleus, amaxitoas. And so I want, to associate, the either literal or metaphorical loci of each of these engagements, undertakings, actions, resumptions, withdrawals, with this place, the amaxitoas, the tripleus amaxitoas, and therefore, one might be able to say that the analepsy, take place under the guidance of Hecate, and the action is always in even in you could say that when Dramatikos eironicus and Dramatikos anagnoreikos, right, arrive at the future palace in Act 4, Scene 2, that it is a kind of, right, it is a kind of even though it's a comedy of errors of it, but it's a kind of an encounter and revelation at the Tropleus Amaxitois. And in this instance, the crossroads, happens to be, where they're called to, rather than, where they proceed, from. But they relate, right? They relate memory and narrative understanding of what occurred at the Tropleus Amaxitois, right? And so both their location in the palace becomes another site or loci of the metaphorical idea of Tropleus Amaxitois. But what they relate as messengers, both Dramatikos, eironicus, spoiler alert, and Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, right, are memories of symbolic and literal, right, or metaphorical and literal crossroads. All right, so the analepsy, is the actions that result from the impetus of the dreams, reside under the aegis of Hecate, goddess of the crossroads, and then and that being played out by Hecate's relationship to the triple goddess, and the triangular figuration, right, of the possibilities that exist at the Tropleus Amaxitois, and its symbolic relationships to the three fades, the spinners, and the spinner, cutter, and the measurer, and then finally the anavasi, the ascent, the climbing, the mounting. You could say that the third scene in each one of the acts, for Tiresias, for Laius, for the Sphinx, and for Oedipus, is all an anavasi, an ascent, a climbing, a mounting, and that too, in a certain respect, relates to this idea of process that, from David's point of view, would be like the deep structure of the narrative transformation, that belongs to each one of the characters. But here it plays itself out as a kind of like Greek alchemy in a certain sense. And you could say that this moment, or this scene for each one of the characters represents, either, well, maybe, it's not either, because I can think of three terms: ascension, transformation, gnosis, and perhaps because, right? Because what we're dealing with is. All of this is supposed to combat, right? All of this is supposed to combat the plague and the sickness of the demos, the sickness of Thebes, the sickness of the people, represented by the chorus and in dream, in the first dream, right? Or was it the second dream? Now I'm failing to remember. No, the first dream was the dream of the serpents, the snakes, and that was the cause of the plague. But it's the second dream that Tiresias has had that we've narrated, through David's narration, in which, it's revealed like that the demos is sick and suffering from this plague that is a result of this taboo, this violation, that is identified, with the act of Oedipus' murder of his father and marriage, his sexual relationship with his mother, right? So perhaps because all of the motivation for the action is to heal the city of Thebes, is to work against the ravages of the plague, that we can see the anavasi for. That is, the third scene in each one of the acts, Act 1, 2, 3, and 4, as perhaps, right, guided by the goddess, Panacea, and the healing goddess that isn't a specialist, right? The name, right, is she's the healer of all. The healer of all sorts of diseases, those that are those that result from violation of sacred taboos, those that result from a failure, to respect, democracy in America, those that result from whatever it is in the malignancy of patriarchal consciousness that allows itself to take away the rights of women to control their destinies and their own bodies. The illnesses that result from harming Gaia, from harming nature, our current destruction of the planet, and dramatic climate change, right? Like I was talking about how cold it was outside when I was walking on the concrete, and that poor little puppy that never gets to go inside, and Fiverr's concerned for him, like dramatic, cold, in the winter and very hot in the summer, dramatic climate change, right? Like, so whatever it is that is sick, what I'm trying to say is, panacea is the opposite of a specialist, right? You go to a specialist on stomach conditions. When I was a child, and this will be another aside, and then we may have to end here because we have outlined this form in the Smile of the Sphinx that I think David, for whatever reason, whether it's that he's following Aristotle because he has read Aristotle's second volume of Poetics that deals with his account of the Smile of the Sphinx and Aristotle's attempt, right, to fit his ontology or not to fit it, but to fit this play into his ontology and the four causes, and it doesn't do so. It doesn't do so as well as apparently it doesn't do so as well as Sophocles' version of the same story, and he has trouble, recognizing this formal structure for whatever reason. And or maybe he resists it. Maybe he resists it because in Aristophanes it's basically an argument for the feminine divine. The structure itself is an argument for the feminine divine, but it's also kind of an argument of the unconscious, of the role of the unconscious in revealing, like, not just aletheia as the truth that belongs to the surface reality of our world, but the deeper layers and meanings of truth and revelation, and as they reside in the spirit world in a certain sense, and the crossings, if one wanted to call it transgressions, through which these mysteries are made, and so. It's more obvious, to someone, versed in the mysteries, perhaps what the structure of the Aristophanes, might be than someone unversed in the mysteries. And Aristotle was a scientist, and in a certain way, David is a scientist as well, and unversed in the mysteries, and so perhaps more capable of understanding, the rational constructions of a syllogismos and a detective story as it unfolds in Sophocles' version than an alchemical investigation of the process of coming to gnosis, transformation, and ascension as it's revealed and hidden simultaneously in the Aristophanes. In any case, because we've managed to convey the idea of our understanding of the form and structure of Aristophanes, and how it unfolds and why it unfolds in that manner. We'll probably conclude here, and then return to Act 1, Scene 2 in our next reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception and Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, Part 12, Danger, Deception. Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. But I was going to conclude with okay, so what so how I'm trying to frame this is the following. So because we've accomplished, something, and we've gotten through that in a certain respect, we've completed, right? We've fulfilled the conditions of a kind of teleiosis, and that teleiosis belongs to this assumption that we set out, to define, toward the outset of what we began, talking about today, which was that that one of the contributions, right, to the way that narrative is and storytelling is always reified, is that it's reified because if we know the outcome of a story, and we know the outcome of a story because we've heard the story in its entirety. Whatever our investment is at the moment in the retelling of the story, we will reconstitute that story, in the own manner of either quasi-linear in very simple accounts, or in radically collaged form, if that's more of our orientation, or more what whatever the context is directing us toward. but that always, in any narrating and storytelling, there is, because it is a gathering of memory, it is a gathering of pieces, from either a material world that belongs to our ontological domain, or to a material world that belongs to a fictive domain, such as the theater space, or as an abstract, right, constitution of narrative that belongs to yet a different kind of material domain, which would be the letters on the page, or the articulations of one's telling, right? So no matter how reified and abstract David's telling is, you could always come back to the fact that, but a contract in phi through theta misrepresented it here, because this is the actual material way these sounds coming from David Antin's mouth unfolded. But we will never recount it exactly the way that David Antin recounted it, just as he will never recount it exactly the way that it was recounted in Aristophanes or Sophocles. Because why? Because memory works that way, because memory has knowledge of events, if we're talking about fiction, that occur, that don't unfold, right, as a bijective function in relationship to the way that the bijective function between that one imagines might exist between David's memory of the Aristophanes, of the smile of the Sphinx, and what he actually articulates and describes as the way that it unfolds. It can never be defined by this one-to-one correspondence, between those two sets of different materialities and two sets of different reifications, right? That at the ideal level, constitute narrative. So you could say that there's inevitably there's both. Inevitably there's both the materiality of the narratological telling as a series of events, and there's the reification that belongs to the narration as narrative or as story. And that to accurately account, for the relationships between the two, the kind of work, right, that we're performing here, necessarily has to be engaged. So that's the first element And then the second element is, okay, also the way, not only, you know, does the context, right, and the memory of all of this that belongs, you know, to David's, the way that David tells the story, and what gets omitted or what jumps out at us from the future or from the past in analepses and prolepses. Not only all of that is going on, which is a, if one wanted to simplify it, one could think about it as, okay, so that's one element that goes into the way that narrative is always already collaged from the beginning, right? And then the second element is what we've just, you know, discovered here in our argument, that if he's reading it, you know, right, through the interpretation, right, through the diarmenia of Aristotle, then he's informed by all of the errors and mistakes or inabilities of Aristotle, you know, to comprehend the form as it's presented in Aristophanes. And we've provided an outline of the way that the form is presented in Aristophanes as othisi, push, boost, impetus, impulse, thrust, in scene 1 as dream, you know, whether that dream, you know, belongs to Phoebe or whether that dream belongs to Morpheus, as it does under Oedipus and Laius. Analepsy, withdrawal, undertaking, assumption, resumption, action, perhaps, you know, and which seems to belong in loci at either the symbolic, metaphorical, or actual loci of a crossroads, the tripleus amoxitoas, and then we've talked about how the palace itself can occupy that function, and under the guidance of the triple goddess, you know, Hecate, the goddess of the crossroads and of keys and of travel and of in a certain sense, in the way that we've been using the term in transgression, parabasis, transgressions of ontological, you know, borders, right? It's like such as the, you know, distinction between the underworld and our world, or even, you know, in the waking world and the dream world in a certain sense. So you're referring her back to Phoebe and Morpheus. And probably why, you know, she's there in the middle, right? The crossroads, not at the end. You know, Aristotle would say, well, you know, it's the othisi because nothing occurs before the dream, and you know, it's the anavasi because nothing occurs after the transformation or the ascension, right? Okay. Anyway, so, and then the analepsy, the withdrawal, the undertaking, the assumption at the crossroads. We talked about that, and then the anavisi, the ascent, the climbing, the mounting, the gnosis, the transformation, the ascension under the terms of panacea. And that's where I said, okay, and I'll narrate, you know, something from my childhood in relationship to the difference between, you know, panacea and a specialist. So when I was a child, I had a there were two sets, you know, that could be defined as illness that I experienced, and I was perhaps in the second or third grade, and one of these, you know, sets of illness, you know, were discomforts in my stomach and inability to eat, you know, certain kinds of food, and you know, gastrointestinitis and you know, stomach pains and you know, all the discomfort that belonged to that. And then another set, you know, was you know, I would sleepwalk and talk in my sleep, and that second set, you know, that perhaps belongs to the othisi, you know, was largely ignored, and I didn't seek, you know, medical assistance for the sleepwalking and the sleep talking and the active dreaming, right, that I experienced, you know, at this point of my life. But my mother, you know, did seek assistance, you know, for the other, you know, set of concerns or illnesses or problems, right, and she sought, you know, the help of a specialist. And so So I went to a specialist, and the specialist, gave me this chalky substance to drink, and I had to drink, a quart of chalk, or basically, and then they took X-rays of my stomach, and all of this and all of that, and in the end of all of this, which was really, a kind of form of torture in a certain way, then, the specialist in the end, told me that, or give us a set of instructions and some, pills perhaps, medication perhaps, and I think the medication was more of this chalky substance, or something very chalky, like whatever it was that allowed them to take these images of my stomach, and it was a list of whatever foods that I was supposed to avoid eating, and it was a list of various kinds of acidic foods. And I remember included tomatoes and citrus fruit, and so these, golden apples or whatever, the Hesperides, I guess, if you want to imagine that was a kind of citrus, but and vinegar, and and tomato sauce, and basically all forms of spicy foods or acidic foods. Well, and then the dream thing, which was certainly also a part of the holistic experience that my psyche was engaged with in this period, was not addressed at all. But but basically I followed the diet for a number of weeks, or perhaps a couple of months, and then when there was no result, and the pills accomplished absolutely nothing, then I abandoned them and kept my stomach problems. Well, many years later, as I as I went through my own process of othisi, analepsy, and anavasi, I discovered that not only was was I mildly lactose intolerant, but that there were a set of rules that I was supposed to follow, and they belong to an ethics and a praxis that involved not killing anything, including any animals, and not consuming the flesh or the substance of my fellow conscious creatures, and when I learned this, which was relatively late in my life, and I had suffered from these stomach difficulties the entirety of my life, from the time that I was in third grade or whatever it was, when I sought the advice of this specialist, and these and these dreams, right, were perhaps compelling me, providing the impetus, the boost to come to understanding of what this praxis and this practice and this ethics was supposed to be, and these dreams would often have animals in them, and but many years later, when I realized that it was possible to give up eating and killing in a certain respect, right? If one takes the responsibility for the death of the animals that one consumes, that it was possible not to engage in this practice and still remain healthy and perhaps healthier as a vegetarian or a vegan, then all of my all of the problems that I had with digestion and stomach and this illness, and that the specialist provided a set of instructions for that didn't help, right? Disappeared, and and have never returned, and the reason is because because however, someone else's, body, responds, to this diet and this substance, mine does not. And the reason that mine does not is because that there are certain rules, that belong to me, that perhaps there were rules for the behavior that Tiresias practiced as well, or there perhaps were rules, that belonged to the mysteries, and that if one wanted to, and one can't even really say wanted, right? One doesn't want, to be involved in this kind of. It simply, one could say, unfolds for one as the terms under which one is. One is, truly, one self, or many selves, or one, or they are truly, themselves. Perhaps is more appropriate. And the specialist, right? That who in a certain way, was also a generalist, because he generalized, about what caused these difficulties and these pains, that I was experiencing. And this for him was spice and acidity, whatever the acidity, might be, whether, it's ascorbic acid or whatever acid, whether it's vinegar or citric acid, right? It was always some kind of acid or some kind of spice. And so the way that you deal with it is you eat chalk and you avoid those spicy foods. Well, the spicy foods were precisely the foods that I could eat, and it was precisely like everything that was left off the list, like meat and chicken and fish and milk and cheese that should have been on the list. So the specialist, who in a certain way was also a generalist, failed like to see the whole picture and to relate, right, like other elements of my story, my narrative, as they were unfolding in the complex web, right, that is who I am, or they are, as they are. And this is the work of the specialist is very different from the work of the goddess Panacea. And in the same way, the work of an Aristotle is very different, right, from the work of Thalia, Phoebe, Hecate, and Panacea.